Hello, and welcome to the Jerome Foundation's Film, Video, and Digital Production and Artist Development Grant Program Work Sample Workshop. Today, we will be focusing on best practices for work sample submissions, both specific to this program's guidelines, and some might be more widely applicable for other opportunities as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
We're joining you today from Minnesota Makoche, also called Minnesota, the homeland of the Dakota people. Today, there are 11 tribes, including 4 Dakota and 7 Anishinaabe. We honor and respect the tribal sovereignty, rights, and cultural resilience of the many Native and Indigenous peoples connected to this land, as well as to the lands of the Lenape, Munsee, Canarsie, and many other tribes, in what is also called New York City. I'm Eleanor Savage. I'm the program director at the Jerome Foundation. I'm pronoun flexible. For a visual description, I have short cropped hair. I'm white-skinned Scots-Irish, wearing black framed glasses, a dark shirt, and a dark suit coat. Behind me, the room is yellow, and you can see a window, a lot of plants, and a very busy bookshelf. I'll pass to Melissa.
Thanks, Eleanor. I'm Melissa Levin. I'm an associate program officer with the foundation based in New York City. I use the pronouns she, her, and for a brief visual description, I am a white-skinned Jewish woman of Eastern European descent. I have dark brown hair with bangs across my forehead. It's a little bit curly, kind of medium length. I'm wearing a cozy oatmeal-colored turtleneck sweater. And the room I'm in is a kind of pinkish lavender color. Behind me on either side is a gray couch and a plant. And I will pass it to Laura.
Hi, my name is Laura Mimosa Montez. I'm an associate program officer in Minnesota. My pronouns are she, her. For a brief visual description, I'm a light-skinned Puerto Rican woman in a home office space with some white walls, seated on a gray couch with some text-based art behind me. So we won't be going over the details and guidelines for the film, video, and digital production and artist development grant programs today, but you can find that information on our website at www.jeromefdn.org.
The goal of today's session is to provide both general and specific information about work samples. First and foremost, we hope that the guidelines and best practices we share today are helpful in putting together your Jerome film, video, and digital production and artist development grant applications. And as mentioned, some of the best practices we share today may also be applicable to other processes and opportunities. That being said, we definitely want to note that every grant program will have unique requirements, and it is important to read any related overview and guidelines thoroughly and respond accordingly to whatever the priorities are for a specific opportunity. Today, we will review the why, who, and how of work samples, and we will do a deeper dive into the Jerome review criteria and required work samples, as well as work sample formats, guidelines, and best practices.
Okay, let's start with the why. Why are work samples so important? Work samples are the central component of your application and are used by review panelists to evaluate the artistic merit of your work. Artistic merit is the highest priority review criteria and carries more weight than the others. So work samples are your opportunity to directly share the work you have created and directed. The samples you share must be works that you have directed versus work that you have edited, produced, acted in, scored, etc., or for which you wrote the screenplay. Because of the significance of work samples in your application, attention to the requirements and recommendations for your work samples is essential. Errors can make or break your application. If you submit an ineligible work sample, for instance, your application is not eligible. We recommend reading thoroughly and following all guidelines and contacting us with questions that aren't answered or on our websites or accompanying materials.
All right, so let's discuss who reviews work samples. Review panels are comprised of a diverse range of film professionals, which can include directors, film curators or programmers, directors or program directors of film organizations, and Jerome former film grantees with the experience and understanding of Minnesota and New York City filmmakers. Panels are assembled to cover a depth and breadth of aesthetics, methodologies, genres, practices, and ways of working. And note that Minnesota and New York City applicants are reviewed by separate panels specific to each location. In terms of the review process, first, program staff reviews to determine eligibility. So they'll be reviewing your applications. And then next, diverse panels of film directors and film professionals with experience and understanding of New York City and Minnesota filmmaking communities review and then recommend grants. Finally, Jerome's board of directors approves the grants. Though we don't reveal specific panelists for a particular application review process, you can view the long list of past Jerome Foundation panelists on the website if you want to learn more.
A little more on how work samples are experienced. They are generally experienced online or electronically on the personal computers, laptops, or desktops of staff and panelists. For this grant program, each panelist typically reviews between 40 and 60 applications, and most panels are now convened over Zoom. While this is a result of trends around environmental and economic consciousness preceding COVID, convening virtually was certainly catalyzed over these past pandemic years. For viewing purposes, we strongly recommend making it as easy as possible to access your work sample. If, for example, you're using Vimeo to host your video, link directly to the video on Vimeo instead of linking to a page on your website that might have additional links to multiple videos. Also, make sure that you do not move the work sample file to a different link, or change the password to access the video, or change the privacy settings, which might make it impossible for reviewers to access your work. At Jerome, we do work with applicants to resolve these kinds of issues, but bear in mind that that might not be the case for other programs. It might also be helpful to have someone who is not using your computer test your links, both to make sure that they work and that your passwords are correct. It can be very hard to test that out yourself on your own computer.
Okay, moving to Jerome Foundation's work sample requirements. We require that you submit 2 different completed works. At least one of the 2 required samples must be a completed work, not created and presented while enrolled in a degree granting program, if applicable. A second required sample must come from a different work that you have completed. This sample may include work created and presented while enrolled in a degree granting program if you feel it represents you at your strongest. These samples can be presented, self-presented, or not yet presented. While we offer flexibility, panelists overwhelmingly prefer work samples representing recent, publicly presented, and non-student work. Film directors who are finishing films and publicly sharing their work demonstrate their capacity for doing the proposed project. The total time for both samples combined is 10 minutes. And if you don't submit 2 completed samples with the specific requirements, your application will be disqualified.
I'll speak now about the optional work in progress sample. All applicants have the option to submit a work in progress work sample from the project proposed. You cannot submit a work in progress sample for a different film than the project for which you are applying. You also can add another completed film in the place of the work in progress sample. If you do not have a work in progress sample from your proposed project, you won't include anything in this section. You will identify a single 3-minute clip for your work in progress sample.
And now a little bit of a deeper dive into the details. Again, you are required to include 2 work samples of a combined 10 minutes total from 2 different works. And the required format is Vimeo or YouTube URLs. And with Vimeo, if you have a password, please provide that. We request that you submit links to complete films and include cue points. While you will identify an excerpt for the panel to watch, some panelists also like to jump around and to see different parts of the work, to see what leads up to your sequence or to see how it gets resolved, for example. Having access to the complete film allows for this possibility. You will be asked to indicate your cue point for each sample, including a start and stop time for your excerpt. Example, starting at 3 minutes and 30 seconds and ending at 8 minutes. And if no start and stop time is provided, panelists will begin watching at the beginning of the video and will have full discretion of when to stop viewing. Note that you may only provide 1 clip per work sample and cannot provide multiple clips from the same film. For example, you can't start at 1 minute and end at 2 minutes, and then jump to 8 minutes and end at 12 minutes in the same film. Panelists want to see uninterrupted sequences of your film work. And a note regarding episodic or web series, you cannot use the same episode or even 2 different episodes from the same web series for both work samples. Keep in mind that in your 2 required work samples, the panel wants to see a range of your creative work.
I'll share here about ineligible work samples. So work samples cannot be promotional videos, trailers, sizzle reels, rough cuts, highlight reels, or music videos, proofs of concept, or interviews about your work. Work samples also cannot be team-based or short-term festival projects, such as 24-hour Film Slam, 48-hour Film Fest, 72 Film Fest. Commercial work, industrial, public service announcements, or journalistic pieces or clips produced for journalistic purposes are also not allowed as work samples.
A little more about some ineligible work samples. You're required to submit film work that you conceived, filmed, and have over which you have creative control. So episodic or web-based series for which you are not the creator and director are not eligible. Films for which you are the producer, editor, DP, etc., and not also the director are not eligible. You must be the director for all work samples. Commissioned work that you did not conceive, even if you're the director, are not eligible. For example, a promotional or biographical video that you are hired to do, or a feature for a broadcast network or a streaming platform would not be eligible samples. We recognize the importance and creativity involved in this type of work. However, for this program, you must have primary and sole creative control, meaning the rights, the copyright of all the films that you submit as work samples.
And this is a brief but important note on work sample eligibility review. After your application is submitted, the Jerome staff reviews all submitted applications to assess if work samples are eligible for panelists to view. If your work samples are not eligible, your entire application will be considered ineligible and the panel will not be able to consider your application.
So I want to talk about the required individual director credits. This is another central component in determining whether your work sample is eligible. We are highlighting this here because this is an issue that has resulted in a significant number of applications being disqualified. So we want to be extra clear. You must be the sole director of all work samples that you submit if you're applying as an individual. This means that you must be listed as the sole director in the credits. Films done as part of a co-directing team are not eligible work samples. You must own the copyright of the production and have artistic, budgetary, and editorial control over the film. And films for which you are the performer, writer, editor, producer, etc., and not also the director, are not eligible. And if we find that you are not the sole director, your application will be disqualified.
And in the hopes of being as clear as possible about crediting requirements, I'll go through a couple of illustrations to explain the difference between credits for individual applicants and credits for co-directing teams. If you are an individual applicant, the directing credit in both of your work sample descriptions and in the film credits in both of your work samples must match exactly, and they must consist solely of your name. On this slide, you can see in the green blocks at the top that work sample 1 and work sample 2 were both directed by J Loves Films, and no one else is listed as a director. This illustration represents a pair of eligible work samples. Demonstrated below in blue blocks, you'll see that the first work sample is directed by J Loves Films and Z Filmmaker, while work sample 2 is directed solely by J Loves Films. In this instance, work sample 1 is not eligible. And even though work sample 2 appears to be eligible, this would disqualify the entire application and it would not be considered further by the panel.
If you're applying as a co-directing team, those listed in the application must share co-directing credits on every work sample. And the co-directing team must be consistent for all samples. The films that you or your co-applicant directed individually are not eligible films, are not eligible. And films directed with other people are also not eligible. You must be listed as the only co-directors in the credits. You must also own together the copyright of the production and have artistic, budgetary, and editorial control over the film. The films for which one or both of you are the performers, writers, editors, producer, but not also the directors, are also not eligible.
So when it comes to co-directing teams, the directing credit in both of your work sample descriptions and the film credits on both of your work samples must match exactly and must consist of the 2 names on the application and only the 2 names on your application. On this slide, you can see in the green blocks at the top that work sample 1 and work sample 2 were both directed by A movie maker and B makes movies, and no one else is listed as a director. This illustration represents a pair of eligible work samples. Demonstrated below in blue blocks, you'll see that the first work sample is directed by a movie maker, and work sample 2 is directed only by B makes movies. In this instance, both work samples are ineligible. This would make the entire application ineligible, and it would not be considered further by the panel.
Moving on, in addition to the work samples themselves, the supporting information you will be asked for in the application about your work samples includes the name of the work, the date completed, and when and where the work has been screened, if that's applicable. We also want to know your roles in the work. Again, you must be the director, but we also recognize that you may play multiple roles in the creation of the work. If you were only the director, you would just enter director. But if you did play multiple roles, please list them out, like director, camera operator, editor, and producer. This information should align with what the film credits show in the sample itself, and also with what is included on your CV. And if you are applying as co-directors, the 2 applicants would list themselves as co-directors, and then you would each share your additional roles on the project if that's applicable.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the work sample context fields in the application. We give you 150 words to share information about your work sample. This is an opportunity to seize. Panelists don't know you and are not familiar with your work and are dropping in to see a short segment of the whole film or video. Providing context helps panelists understand the significance of the sample that you're sharing. This is a way to connect the dots for the panel. Don't take anything for granted. Clearly describe to the panel what you want them to know about your work. And this can include a brief log line or description of the film that you're sharing a clip of, and any important information about the sections of the work occurring either before or after the sample clip, or where and how this fits into the film. Context should add to what the panel sees, not tell them what they will see. So there's no need to do a point-by-point description of what the panelist will see. You might offer explanations for elements that might not be clearly perceptible in the work samples, but are related to your goals as a filmmaker. Drawing panelists' attention to specific elements of your work. For example, this sample shows the work I am doing with sound design or visual effects or long camera takes. You can also point out anything to prioritize or note about your work sample itself. For example, you might share that you're working on a specific technique and that this will be important in the proposed film, and share how this work sample demonstrates the way that you're using this technique. For example, a dream montage or a flashback sequence. Panelists value filmmakers' candor and self-awareness. So be open around any production issues that you have in your samples. For example, you might say, this sample shows my direction and intimacy work with actors in an emotionally complex moment. And I know the sound mix is off, and I'm working with a new sound designer and editor to improve the balances. This is setting the panelists up to view the sample through your lens. And as we've mentioned, panelists prefer recent work. If you're submitting a work sample that is older than 5 years, take this opportunity to explain why. Panelists prefer to see work created and completed outside of your enrollment in a degree granting program. And though you have this option for one sample, you should explain why you've selected this work in the context field.
So beyond the videos and the contextual information, a script sample from the proposed project is required for narrative films or hybrid films with a narrative focus. So you'll upload the proposed project script as a PDF. The script excerpt allows the panel to gauge the quality of the writing and assess your ability to create character, structure, rhythm, etc. If you work in narrative film but do not work from scripts and instead rely on an improvised process, you must explain that process and submit an alternative to the script sample, so possibly an improvisational structure or outline that helps the panel assess your skills in directing unscripted work. You're also strongly encouraged to make sure that one of the 2 work samples was developed through this improvised process, if applicable. If you work in narrative form, but also still in the storyboarding phase, the panel will not have enough information to consider your proposal, and you should not apply in this round. Given the production focus of this grant program, having a finished script is key. A storyboard, lookbook, visual concept, or project outline may be provided for films in any genre, but it's not required. These supplemental materials are especially helpful if you don't have a work in progress, allowing panelists to gauge how you are developing the project, characters, structure, rhythm, and visual concepts.
Now that we've covered all of the requirements, we want to share with you a few suggestions that we have heard from panelists over the years. And these are suggestions, not requirements. The first suggestion is to start your application and work sample selection well in advance of the deadline. Working in advance gives you time to get feedback. Show your work samples to at least one person who knows nothing about your project for feedback to determine if your samples are effectively conveying what you want to share. Also, if there's someone you worked with who knows the whole film, ask them about your work sample selection. They might have additional ideas of compelling scenes. Always submit what you feel is your best film work and choose compelling sequences. So what is a compelling sequence? This depends on the type of work you're doing, but in general, it is a scene that draws the viewer into the world of your film. This might be one that reveals the complexity of a character, or gives a sense of the emotional stakes, or a punchline, or a moment of discovery or transformation, or a clip that shows your strong visual aesthetic and gives a sense of the pacing. Panelists are looking at 80 to 120 samples, so you want to capture their attention immediately. Don't start with a credit sequence. Another suggestion is to consider your work samples as in conversation with the written application. So be intentional in talking about the way your work samples connect to the proposed project. Sometimes the filmmaker's written application is strong, but the work sample does not live up to or deliver on the promise of the application. In other cases, we hear panelists talk about the written application isn't particularly clear, but an outstanding work sample can turn it around. So share samples that expand the panel's knowledge of the project rather than replicating something already written, and think about the breadth and depth of your work. Select work samples that resonate or demonstrate your capacity for the project you're applying for. If you're submitting an application for an experimental documentary with animation sequences, think about other works you have that demonstrate how you're combining these forms. And if you're working on a narrative film that involves humor, show other samples that help the panel see a range of the ways that you work with humor. Provide recent work samples, and we recommend works created within the last 5 years. And if for some reason you're sharing work samples from earlier in your career, use those context fields to explain why you made that choice. Again, panelists want to see a range of work demonstrating development over time, your dedication to the field, craft, and potential. And this is where having an outside eye on what you're choosing can be helpful.
Before we go, we want to remind you that applications are due Thursday, April 13th by 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern, and late applications will not be accepted. If you're having any technical issues, you can contact Submittable using the link at the bottom of the page, or you can contact Andrea Brown at the Jerome Foundation. We hope this has been informative. Thank you so much for coming, and we wish you the best of luck with your applications.